Hello and welcome again to Understanding Transitional Justice. I want to continue the presentation for our second week by talking about international initiatives in post-conflict and post-regime justice, that is, efforts to bring the um, requirements of post-conflict and post-regime justice into the framework of international law. And I have said that these are post-World War II initiatives. They generally are. Although at the end of the First World War, there were some unsuccessful initiatives. Let me try to offer some background here and briefly tell the story of these initiatives. Um, the first thing to remember, the First World War. The Second World War tends to get a lot of attention, the First World War a bit less. I think one of the things that the First World War is remembered for, what made it traumatic in the context of the history of the world, was the really large-scale abuse of civilians that occurred during that war, the targeting of civilian communities, of cities and of towns and of entire communities in incidents like the Armenian genocide, for example, and the use of military technology that was being rapidly developed at the point to to damage not only civilians but also soldiers. It's in the context of the First World War that you see the large-scale use of aviation, of air power, airplanes to bomb and otherwise attack communities. It's where you see the large-scale deployment of chemical warfare, of chemicals, especially gases, designed to disable and incapacitate people that provided permanent injury. It is not a coincidence that in the period after the First World War, you begin to see the development of movements in art, like expressionism and like surrealism, ones that deal with graphic representation of extremes of human experience and transformation of the image of the human, because this was a part of the experience of the war. It's also in the context of the First World War that you see the development of some of the first major international law initiatives to try to bring the legal power of the international community to the purpose of control of institutions. You see the Kellogg-Briand Pact, in which war as a means of settling international disputes is declared illegal, although, as I think we know from over 100 years of experience since the end of the First World War, the Kellogg-Briand Pact had very little effect. It was the shock at information about the Armenian genocide that led to an initiative for the leaders of the regime and of the military of the so-called Young Turk government in Turkey to be brought to justice, and there was some effort to try people for abuses committed during the course of that campaign, which managed to operate until the Republic of Turkey became powerful enough to resist them. There were no prosecutions after 1922 of people who were charged with abuses in the Armenian genocide. One of the stories that is told about this is that although in the absence of judicial answers to the crimes that were committed, many Armenians around the world organized into groups that carried out revenge attacks against people who were suspected of committing abuses but were not prosecuted. But the story is told that Adolf Hitler, in planning what came to be called the final solution, that is, the genocides of the period of the Second World War, when asked about possible legal consequences or other repercussions for the scale of crime that was going to be committed, said, or may not have said, who remembers the Armenians? That is, this became an image for the effort at justice that was abandoned, and there were other efforts at justice that were abandoned. In Germany, there was an effort to prosecute World War I era high-ranking military officers for abuses that were committed, especially against prisoners of war. There was less interest in the time in abuses committed against civilians. The first trial was held in Leipzig, and one of the results of this trial, an old general was brought in. He had been retired. This is somebody who had been injured during his military service. What the public saw at the trial was an old person who appeared to be helpless, being charged with crimes. The prosecution was rapidly abandoned, and the general was not convicted. Similarly, there was an effort by some international states to prosecute the ruler of Germany during the time of the First World War, Kaiser Wilhelm II, which was supported by some states and opposed by others. Kaiser Wilhelm went to the Netherlands, where he took refuge in a palace owned by the royal family of the Netherlands, and evaded an arrest that nobody ever really tried to make. So what I want to say here is there was some kind of consciousness, there were some efforts on the part of states, on the part of lawyers, on the parts of organized civic groups to recognize the necessity of prosecution after the First World War, but these came to very little result. Now, the effort was revived again during the Second World War. It's during the Second World War that you see some of the innovations in international law that have come to be important in the period, in the contemporary period. It's during that time that lawyers like Hirsch Lauderpecht developed the idea of command responsibility, of refined the concept of crimes against humanity. It's during that time that Raphael Lemkin coins the word genocide and develops a theory of the law of genocide and a campaign to make genocide an offense under international law, which was successful eventually after the Second World War. The Genocide Convention was ratified by the United Nations and came into law in 1951. It was after the Second World War that you saw the international military tribunals, which in some sense have been taken to have played a historic role, although this historic role is perhaps inflated in relation to their actual achievements. Let me put it this way: if you were to check public opinion during the time that the war was being fought, the idea of providing fair trials to the leaders of the regimes that were opponents of the Allies in the Second World War was not popular. One of the influential advisors to Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, suggested destroying all of German industry, of turning it into an agricultural state that would not have the power to threaten anybody. What Joseph Stalin, who was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, suggested was summary executions of the highest-ranking officers of the Nazi regime in Germany and of the military. He estimated that something like 50,000 people would have to be summarily executed. If you looked at public opinion polls in the United Kingdom, more people agreed with Stalin than agreed with the proposal that fair trials ought to be provided. But the Nuremberg Tribunal was established, and I think we all know the legend of the Nuremberg Tribunal, that it provided a trial of reasonably good legal quality with presentation of evidence and executed judgments against people who were charged and convicted and acquitted some. The famous quotation from the chief prosecutor before the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal, Robert Jackson, who took time off to be prosecutor for the tribunal from his other job, which was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. He lauded the effort. He said that the Nuremberg Tribunal represented an effort to achieve goals by law and to, his famous phrase is, stay the hand of vengeance. So this is looked upon as a great achievement of law, a moment in which legal rationality dominated over the impulse to revenge, to achieve goals. But it's important to remember that the Nuremberg Tribunal was limited in scope and in the time in which it operated. A very small number of people were prosecuted by it, and it was not a tribunal formed by the United Nations or another international body. It was a military tribunal that was formed by the occupying powers. Its courts behaved differently in different zones of occupation in Germany at the end of the war. And Nuremberg was not the only military tribunal. There were two military tribunals that were formed at the end of the Second World War. The second one was the Tokyo Tribunal. And the Tokyo Tribunal adopted a much less formally legalistic approach than the Nuremberg Tribunal. What the prosecution at the Tokyo Tribunal did was they defined the entire Japanese government during the period of the Second World War as a conspiracy to commit crimes. Now, the thing about the legal theory about conspiracy is that to convict somebody under a charge of conspiracy, it is not necessary to demonstrate that they actually committed a crime. It's sufficient to demonstrate that they were a part of the conspiracy. So if the government is defined as representing a conspiracy, what this means is that a prime minister and foreign minister of Japan during this period were convicted for crimes committed during the time that they held office, which they opposed during their time in office. Probably one of the great miscarriages of justice of the Tokyo Tribunal was the prosecution of the general who had been commander of Japanese forces in the Philippines. He became commander of the Japanese forces in the Philippines after the American invasion of the Philippines had already begun. He, in fact, never went to the Philippines, never met any troops that were under his command. But during the time that he was formally the commanding officer, Japanese troops in the Philippines committed a massacre. He was prosecuted on the basis of command responsibility for this massacre and sentenced to death, a sentence that was carried out. Most people regard this case as representing a miscarriage of justice, and probably from the contemporary point of view of legal interpretation, that was a miscarriage of justice. That is, command responsibility does say that commanders are responsible for actions committed by troops under their command, but it also imposes the requirement that these commanding officers need to have actually exercised command and to have had the capacity to prevent and punish crimes, which the military officers tried under the principle of command responsibility by the Tokyo Tribunal did not. It is probably partly for this reason that it's possible to see in Germany, where the Nuremberg Tribunal operated, a very, very significant change in public memory and public consciousness related to crimes committed during the Second World War, while there is not a similar sort of popular consciousness or education or cultural campaign in Japan, to which we might add the fact that Japan, in addition to having been a perpetrator of crimes during the Second World War, was also a victim of crimes during the Second World War, including the only use of nuclear weapons against a civilian population that's recorded in history, the bombing of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the war, which, if you want to look at the Geneva and Hague Conventions, is expressly forbidden, but was not considered a crime by the state that committed it, has not been charged or prosecuted, and probably never will be. Another thing that we can talk about at the end of the Second World War is large-scale operation of revenge justice in states, especially states that had been under German occupation, so that in several states, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in Yugoslavia, members of the ethnic German population, and in Yugoslavia also the ethnic Italian population, were forcibly expelled, were imprisoned and forcibly expelled at the end of the war on the ground that they were associated with collaborators, whether they were collaborators or not. In fact, some were and some were not. In many cities, in France, in Italy, in Yugoslavia, in Hungary, in states all across Europe, there was revenge justice carried out at the communal level, in which people who were popularly identified, whether by good evidence or not, as being collaborators, were publicly tried by tribunals that were not constituted legally, were publicly punished and publicly humiliated, so that in addition to the legal legacy that develops out of the end of the Second World War, there is also an extra legal legacy that develops out of it. And this means that, in a sense, this legacy is at least partly undermined in the sense of its legitimacy. Now, if we want to look at the period, the decades coming after the Second World War, at what initiatives were undertaken, the answer is there wasn't much. Or let me put it this way. The United Nations passes the Genocide Convention after the end of the Second World War. It passes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a number of other instruments designed to protect civilians. It passes elaborations on the Hague and Geneva Conventions that extend the scope of its protection. But on the international level, no action is taken until 1993. So there is this period of almost 50 years after the end of the Second World War in which international justice exists on paper in the form of laws, but enforcement mechanisms for these laws do not exist. In 1993, partly as a result of media coverage, partly as a result of investigations that have been authorized by the United Nations, the first international tribunal formed by the United Nations is created, and that is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is created by a resolution of the Security Council in 1993. It is shortly after that that the second international tribunal to be created by the United Nations is formed, and that is the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 1994. So these are the first efforts of international institutions to create institutions that would establish some form of accountability and some form of justice. Now, if we want to talk about the records of the Yugoslavia and the Rwanda tribunals, there is a good deal to be said, and they had some successes. The first international conviction on charges of genocide in history was issued by the International Tribunal for Rwanda against Jean-Paul Akayesu. The first judgments that included sexual violence as an element of war crimes were issued by the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia in several cases. But these are also tribunals that consistently faced problems with legitimacy and problems with communication with the public, principally for two reasons. One reason was that both of these tribunals were located outside of the territories over which they had jurisdiction. So the Yugoslavia Tribunal was located in the Netherlands with its seat in The Hague. The Rwanda Tribunal was located in Tanzania, a neighboring state but outside of the borders of Rwanda. Both of them employed as judges and prosecutors no people from the states over which they had oversight, so that the only way that a person could appear, other than a witness as a part of these tribunals, was either as a person charged with a crime or as a lawyer representing a person charged with the crime. And probably the third shortcoming of these first-generation tribunals was that they had a dual role. One was to conduct trials at a good professional level, as expected by judges and by lawyers, and another was to produce a record of history that would lead to accounting. And it very quickly became clear that for a court to do both of these tasks was unwieldy, and that for lawyers to write history is a bad idea for several reasons. So in the responses to the failure of tribunals, you could see some kind of adoption of these criticisms. So a number of ad hoc tribunals were formed after the tribunals for former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. There was a tribunal for Sierra Leone, a tribunal for East Timor, a tribunal for Cambodia. There have been a number of them in several places in the world. And what all of these tribunals did, they tried to address these criticisms by employing local people as staff, including judges and prosecutors, by having their location, their place of operation, in the countries over which they had oversight, and by separating the work of prosecuting defendants from the work of writing history, that is, parallel to the tribunal's investigative commissions and reporting commissions and fact-finding commissions were appointed to produce reports. A further source of dissatisfaction with tribunals, there is a difference between a tribunal and a court, which is that a tribunal is created for a specific purpose and is temporary. A court is permanent. So there was a large-scale campaign on the part of civic organizations, on the part of legal professionals and some governments, to establish a permanent international court that would be responsible for the application of international humanitarian law in criminal cases. This was finally achieved with the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 2003 under the Rome Statute. So there is now a global court that, formally speaking, has oversight over abuses of international humanitarian law, with some problems. One is that the International Criminal Court has been limited in the extent to which it can exercise its oversight. The statute of the International Criminal Court requires the consent of party states for their citizens to be prosecuted, and requires the consent of party states for suspects to be sent to them and for evidence to be sent to them. A second problem that they have is that some of the most powerful states in the world, including the United States, have not signed on to the International Criminal Court. This is partly for ideological reasons and partly because of, and at least partly justified fear on the part of the United States, that because of its large-scale exposure around the world as a great power, that its citizens would be more exposed to prosecution by the International Criminal Court than citizens of other states. And there is also a lack of power. So people do like to raise the fact that all of the people up to now, at least, who have been charged with crimes before the International Criminal Court come from a single continent. They all come from Africa. And this may be a temporary condition, it may be coincidental, but many people regard it as a reflection of the fact that the operation of international institutions reflects the uneven distribution of power and influence in the world on the global scale. Now, I've told you before, the history of post-conflict and post-regime justice initiatives in the world is relatively short, seems to go in fits and starts, and most of the activity that we can talk about seriously in a seminar like this seems to begin around 1993 or at some point in the years after that. So how do we account for the sudden emergence of large-scale initiatives, including global initiatives, in the enforcement of international humanitarian law? I think there are several factors that we can point to, and I want to underline a few here. One, I think, is the influence of global media. That is, because of the spread of things like cable television and later internet, we are able to find out about abuses as they're happening, which enter into the formation of global public opinion and create greater pressure on political decision makers than probably existed in the periods before. Second, I think this is something that we were able to see with the human rights abuses committed by military regimes in Central America and South America in the 1970s and 1980s, but also with recent conflicts like the ones in North Africa and the Middle East, and especially the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia. You had civil society organizations that were documenting crimes, that were providing evidence, that were demanding accountability for them as they were happening, and these groups received some kind of exposure and had some kind of attention from international political institutions. And all of this happens in the context of globalization, and globalization is a little bit of a dirty word. It can be used to mean several different things, some of which are not entirely consistent with one another. The element of globalization that is important here is that networks of communication, of knowledge, and networks of political communication and engagement become global so that it is possible for opinion to be influenced in states other than the ones where violations are happening, including states that are more powerful and more influential than the ones in which violations are happening. And it is probably worth underlining too that the kinds of initiatives that we've seen in the last several decades probably could not have happened during the period when of imperial rule, when much of the world was subject to colonial authority and was not ruled by independent states. That independent states have greater autonomy and a greater call upon the force of public opinion than do colonized populations. Finally, I want to raise a question, and that is a question as to whether this explosion of activity that we saw beginning around the mid-1990s has come to an end. Whether there seems to be less enthusiasm for prosecution of crimes, like the ones that are going on in the conflict in Syria on a much larger scale than the ones in former Yugoslavia, for example, or crimes committed by regimes in states subject to political change, like Myanmar, crimes committed by relatively influential global states, like the abuses being committed against the Uyghur population now in China. These don't seem to have met the same kind of demand for justice, or at least not an effective demand for justice, in the same way that the offenses committed in that mid-90s period and the period immediately after that have met. So we can raise the question of whether the enthusiasm for establishment of justice and for post-conflict and for post-regime initiatives has dissipated, and if so, why is it dissipated? These are all questions that I do not pretend to have answers to, but that I welcome discussion about when we meet in our seminar, which we will do on Monday. I'll see you then.